The North Atlantic War by Michael Trela. Operation Stepping Stone. Stage 2. Iceland under siege. Are you certain that this is legitimate? General Jonathan Blake stared forcibly at the adept who stood before him aboard the HMS Elizabeth II. As commander of the British Expeditionary Reinforcement Division, it was his duty to ensure that the correct course of action was taken. An illegitimate claim could throw them into a similar cataclysm that had enveloped their predecessors. If it is, then that means that they've allied themselves with the Republic, and are therefore enemies to both the United Kingdom and Denmark, said Admiral Herbert Grinion. He was in his third year as Admiral of the British Atlantic Fleet. Rolfe had been a close friend of his since the earliest days at the Academy. Upon hearing that he'd been taken prisoner, Grinion had sworn to avenge his defeat and make the enemy pay for what they did. The message comes directly from the Prime Minister himself, sirs, replied the adept, and he received the message during a personal call from the Danish Premier, who claimed that their intelligence had taken every action to ensure that the intercepted transmission was indeed a legitimate testament of aid to the Republic. Why would they do such a thing? Another officer asked himself aloud. It seems awfully foolish of them to side with the Republic when it entails war with two members of the United Nations. Perhaps our initial invasion's failure gave them confidence in the Republic's capabilities, Blake replied with a frown. Or maybe they've been planning this for quite some time. Whatever the cause may be, interjected Grinion, the results are quite clear. Iceland has chosen to aid the Republic in this war, and have therefore declared war on us. They are now an enemy of the United Kingdom, and must be dealt with accordingly. The room was somber at the news. This was an unexpected turn of events indeed. It seemed completely out of the blue for Iceland to suddenly jump in and begin supplying arms and ammunition to the Greenlanders. Yet, despite how random it seemed, the Danes assured them that the transmission was verified, and they were in no mood to argue with their ally over it. Well, then I suppose our orders are clear. General Blake straightened up as he shattered the silence. We must make for Iceland with all speed. Admiral, we must have the support ships at full combat preparedness. I believe that if we strike quickly enough, we may catch them completely off guard. A sailor at the communications console suddenly turned around. Admiral, we have a transmission from the Danish fleet. Grinion's brow furrowed at the mention of their allies. What do they have to say? They say that they're in position to strike tomorrow morning at 0400 hours. What? Blake bellowed in surprise. They're already there? The rest of the bridge began buzzing with uneasy murmurs as the news sank in. They must have already been traveling through Icelandic waters when they intercepted the transmission, one of the aides proposed. I'm not sure, said another. It all seems a bit suspicious, if you ask me. The general shot the younger man a death stare. Are you doubting our allies' intentions, aide? No, sir. I didn't mean it like that. Gentlemen, Admiral Grinion cut in. This is neither the time nor the place to discuss such serious matters. The Danes, our allies, are ready to strike at this new enemy to prevent them from providing assistance to the Republic. It is our duty to lend them our strength with all possible speed. The bridge went silent. Though the entire situation still sat ill with many present, they understood all too well the truth behind the Admiral's words. Very well, General Blake said at length. We make for Iceland and rendezvous with the Danish forces. It's settled then, replied Grinion. Everyone back to your stations. Soon the usual hum of Navy men at work permeated the bridge once more, as the crew of the Elizabeth II resumed their assigned tasks. General Blake began making his way back to his cabin, but was stopped when he heard the Admiral's voice call out to him from across the hall. General, may I have a word? Blake turned and followed him to his cabin. Grinion held the door for him. Once they had entered, he locked it shut. You know, the aide's suggestion back on the bridge is not completely ill-founded. I know, the general replied. Iceland barely has an army, and yet they send a message saying that they're going to lend aid to the Republic? Indeed, the Icelandic Defense Force has nothing to show in terms of military aid. Perhaps they meant supplies, Or possibly giving over land to be used as forward bases. I doubt it. Iceland is suffering as much as everyone from the economic strains that seem to be plaguing the world at present. They need all the resources they can muster. Blake removed his hat and ran a hand through his glossy black hair. And yet the Danish premier himself attests to the claim's validity, saying that his intelligence units not only intercepted the message, but also ran it through all the tests to prove its legitimacy. He shrugged his shoulders. It makes no sense. Grinion slowly nodded his head. It's quite the dilemma indeed. They expect us to attack a fellow member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization based on so little evidence. He stood up and straightened his coat. It could lead to a lot of trouble with the United Nations. I guess all we can do is say that it's our duty to king and country. For king and country. Sir, the Icelandic Defense Forces are retreating. General Iverson could see nothing but wasteland for miles around. Establishing a beachhead had been easy. Child's play. The Icelanders had been caught completely by surprise by their sudden attack, and now the Danish invasion force was driving furiously across the island, wiping out the defenders' resistance. Husavik had been taken within hours, and served as an excellent forward command center. Excellent. I want our men to take Reykjavik by nightfall. We set up camp there and then press on through Vatnajökull National Park. With the country effectively divided in half, we'll be unstoppable. Yes, sir. But our forward positions are encountering increasingly heavy resistance. The enemy have regrouped, and have begun making fiercer and fiercer counterattacks. Iverson smiled and stepped out of his tent. That will be taken care of soon enough, Captain. As we speak, our British allies are moving in on a target of absolute strategic value for the Icelanders. Once they've attacked, our job will become a lawn-mowing operation. The captain's eyes widened. General, are you speaking of Reykjavik? Iverson simply kept smiling and nodded his head. The morning horizon was aglow with a crimson aura. Yet 'twas not the sun that gave the southern sky its bloody hue, but the myriad forest fires ignited by the relentless advance of his troops. A thought came to him, and his smile was slowly replaced with a visage of pure hatred. This is going to be you, Republic scum. Why? For God's sake, why? The soldier pulled his helmet over his face as another explosion whipped dirt and debris around them. They couldn't understand what on earth had brought them to this, but for some reason they were being attacked by the Danes from the north and the British from the south. The last thing he'd heard before being thrown into the battle was that Reykjavik was under siege and that his regiment was to be deployed at once. Before that, he'd been hoping that he'd be spared being sent north to stave off the Danish invasion, which had come completely out of nowhere. By the time his regiment had arrived in Reykjavik, the entire coast had been bombarded and overrun. Adam! The voice brought him back to reality. Looking over his shoulder, he saw another Defense Force trooper hurrying over to him, his left arm wrapped in a white bandage that barely stemmed the flow of blood from his wound. Nathan! I can't believe you survived! Well, most of me did. His friend pointed to his arm. I can't feel it at all, but at least the pain has gone away for now. Either way, what the devil is going on? Why are the British and Danes attacking us? How should I know? Adam shouted back, his voice immediately drowned out by another thunderous explosion. Whatever their reason is, they're sure insistent. More than half the city is overrun, and I hear that the Prime Minister has been evacuated. Then what reason in all hell do we have to still be fighting here? He threw up both his arms in frustration, but immediately brought them back down as pain flared up in his arm. We can at least hold them off until the civilians are evacuated. The civilians? Nathan's eyes shot open in horror. You mean they attacked so suddenly that an evac order wasn't issued before the assault began? Adam's eyes darkened, and he nodded his head. From what I heard down the line, there are 3 times more civilian casualties than Defense Force. Nathan's skin turned pale. But that means... But home is... No. Oh no. Please, no! Without any further warning, he bolted off down the defensive line, leaving his assault rifle behind. Nathan! Adam called out. but he was cut off when a shell detonated between them. The soldier just catching a glimpse of his friend's lifeless corpse being hurled through the air before the shock of the blast knocked him to the ground. As he struggled to make his eyes stop rolling about in their sockets, he could hear the sounds of his fellows shouting and cursing. A split second later, he found out why. As he finally pushed himself back onto his feet, the clatter of treads crunching over debris and broken bodies filled the air. He froze, not daring to look up and over the redoubt wall. Heavy caliber cannons roared, machine guns blazed, men screamed, and throats gurgled, but Adam couldn't move. Suddenly a shadow cast itself over his own. Time seemed to slow down. His heartbeat was like a thunderstorm in his head. Not like this. Please, God, not like this. He turned around, hoping against hope that he would somehow be spared. Time resumed its normal tempo, just as the Challenger tank's tread came crashing over the redoubt and its defenders. The skies above Copenhagen were dark and dreary, rain cascading down from the heavens in angry torrents. Wrathful flashes of lightning danced high above, followed by the woeful lamenting of thunderclaps. The streets were empty, the city's inhabitants having chosen to stay indoors rather than risking falling ill due to the inclement weather. As yet another boom of thunder resounded through the atmosphere outside, a knock came at the door to the Premier's office. The man himself sat comfortably in his chair, his eyes hidden behind a touchscreen tablet. "Enter," he shouted across the room, his gaze never leaving the device which he held before him. The door creaked open, and in stepped his secretary. "My Premier, you have a message from General Iverson." "Really now?" he replied, still not looking up at the woman. "And what does my trusted general have to say?" "He says that the British have sent their forces to Reykjavik as planned. He left an audio recording of the message for you to hear." She stepped forward and held out a small memory stick. "Excellent," Van Housen replied, accepting the extended device. "You're dismissed." The young woman saluted and made her way out the door. Yet even as she did so, she could feel his cold, steel gaze boring into the back of her head. It was the gaze of a man of power, a man whose presence radiated that feeling of, if you disappoint me, you die. She quickened her pace, nearly slamming the door shut behind her in her hurry to be out of the Premier's line of sight. The Premier watched her go. Once the door was shut, however, he plugged the memory stick into his tablet and downloaded its content. It took a good 5 seconds or so. The message was purely audio, so no image appeared on the screen when he played it. "My Premier," came the familiar voice of General Iverson, "the invasion is going as planned, and should be completed right on schedule. It would appear that the information we sent to the British has convinced them to join in the undertaking as well. Once again, your genius has seen us through, my Premier. Do give my compliments to your new representative on the intelligence team. He did a fine job with the intercepted transmission." Once the message ended, Van Housen laid the tablet onto his desk and smiled, slightly chuckling to himself. "Oh, I will. After all, he's the best at mimicking Icelandic diplomatic transmissions we have." He pushed the small pager on his desk, and in stepped the brawny soldiers who had been standing guard outside. "Send someone to keep an eye on Miss Poulsen." The two nodded and marched out the door once again. Reykjavik lay in ruins. Smoke wreathed the city in its entirety. The smells of gunpowder, discarded ammo casings, rotting corpses, and bowels released in death made the air near impossible to breathe. Wherever the eye was cast, not a single structure could be seen undamaged or unbloodied. Armor patrols could still be heard as they ground their way through the broken streets of Iceland's degenerate capital, while groups of British soldiers herded captives, civilian and military alike, toward the makeshift prison camps wrought out of the wreckages of warehouses and hotels. Atop the city's capitol building, a single flagpole was erected. 2 flags drifted back and forth in the dead air. The Danish flag bearing the hammer, scythe, and bayonet of the Communist Party, and the Union Jack. It was the ultimate symbol of victory for the two nations. In the wake of a war for Greenland, Iceland,